When my brother got married, everyone got an invite, except me. Dad said, "We didn't think you'd fit in with his new family." So I quietly canceled the $18,000 I was sending each year to help with their mortgage. This morning, he called in a panic. "Dad's driving around looking for you," and Mom's crying in the living room. I, 32M, found out about my brother's wedding the same way most people learn about distant acquaintances getting married, through social media. A perfectly staged photo of him in a tuxedo, beaming next to his bride, with the caption thanking everyone who made their special day possible. The comments were filled with congratulations from family members I recognized, cousins I grew up with, even our elderly neighbors from childhood. People who had clearly been there, celebrating, while I sat in my apartment 3 states away completely oblivious. The sick feeling in my stomach wasn't just about missing the wedding. It was about what it meant. I scrolled through more photos, recognizing face after face of people who had received invitations while I apparently hadn't warranted even a courtesy call. I called my parents' house that evening. Mom answered, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice when she realized it was me. She'd clearly been dreading this conversation. When I asked why I hadn't been invited, she handed the phone to Dad without a word. Dad's explanation was delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. He told me they didn't think I'd fit in with my brother's new family. The bride came from money, he explained, old money with certain expectations. My brother was trying to make a good impression with his new in-laws, and having me there might complicate things. I pressed him on what exactly that meant. His response was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty disguised as practical concern. He reminded me that I didn't have a college degree, that my job in construction wasn't exactly prestigious, that I'd always been more comfortable in work boots than dress shoes. The new family was sophisticated, educated, the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and had opinions about wine vintages. I just wouldn't understand their world. The conversation ended with him suggesting I shouldn't take it personally. It was just business, he said, like my brother was merging companies rather than getting married. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the stack of bills on my counter. Among them was the monthly transfer receipt for the money I sent home, $1,500 that went directly toward their mortgage payment. I'd been sending that money for almost 12 years, ever since I started making decent money and learned they were struggling. The routine had become so automatic I barely thought about it anymore. Every month, the same transfer, the same brief text from Mom thanking me, the same assumption that this was just what family did for each other. $18,000 a year, no questions asked, no expectations of gratitude or recognition, just quiet support from the son who apparently didn't fit in. But sitting there that night, doing the math in my head, I realized something that made my chest tight with anger. That money, my money, had probably helped pay for the wedding I wasn't invited to. The mortgage payments I'd been covering had freed up their other resources that went toward flowers and catering and venue rentals for an event where I was considered too embarrassing to include. The next morning, I called my bank and canceled the automatic transfer. The customer service representative asked if I wanted to reschedule it or set up a different amount. I told her no, just cancel it completely. She processed the request with professional efficiency, and that was it. 12 years of financial support ended with a 2-minute phone call. I didn't announce what I'd done. I didn't send angry texts or make dramatic pronouncements. I just quietly removed myself from their financial equation the same way they'd quietly removed me from their family celebration. If I wasn't good enough to stand beside my brother on his wedding day, then my money wasn't good enough to keep their house payments current either. The first month passed without any contact from them. I wondered if they'd even noticed the missing payment or if they'd just assumed it was a banking error they'd figure out eventually. My life continued normally. Work projects, weekend activities, the simple satisfaction of seeing my own bank account balance grow for the first time in years. It was strange how quickly I adjusted to having that extra money. I bought new tools for work, upgraded my truck, started contributing more to my retirement account. Small luxuries I'd been putting off for over a decade suddenly seemed reasonable. I realized I'd been living like a man, making much less than I actually earned, subsidizing my parents' lifestyle, while keeping my own deliberately modest. The second month brought a text from Mom asking if everything was okay with my bank. She mentioned they hadn't received the usual transfer and wondered if there was a technical problem. I replied that everything was fine on my end, which was technically true. She didn't ask any follow-up questions, and I didn't volunteer any additional information. Month 3 was when the reality of the situation apparently began to sink in. Dad called one evening, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't quite mask his concern. He brought up the missed payments as if they were a minor clerical issue, suggesting maybe I should call my bank to sort out whatever glitch was preventing the transfers from going through. I told him there was no glitch. The transfers had stopped because I'd stopped sending them. The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted to something harder, more demanding. He wanted to know what game I was playing. I explained that I wasn't playing any game. I'd simply decided to redirect my financial priorities toward investments that actually valued my participation. He started to argue, but I cut him off. I reminded him that he'd made it clear I didn't fit into their family's new direction, so I was adjusting my budget accordingly. The conversation devolved quickly from there. Dad accused me of being petty and vindictive, of punishing them for my brother's personal choices. I pointed out that the wedding guest list hadn't been my brother's choice alone. It had been a family decision that I was somehow unsuitable for public display. If that was how they felt about me, then perhaps my money was equally unsuitable for their private use. Dad's voice rose as he explained how much they depended on that money, how their budget was structured around it, how they'd used it to qualify for their current mortgage rate. The irony wasn't lost on me that my rough around-the-edges construction income had been refined enough to impress mortgage brokers, just not refined enough to impress wedding guests. I let him talk until he ran out of steam, then quietly told him that dependency worked both ways. They depended on my money while simultaneously maintaining that I wasn't dependable enough to include in important family events. The math on that arrangement had finally stopped working for me. The months that followed brought a variety of contact attempts, each with a slightly different approach. Mom tried the guilt route, sending photos of bills and past due notices, reminding me how much they'd sacrificed when I was younger. My brother called once, attempting to position himself as a neutral mediator while subtly suggesting I was being unreasonable about something as simple as a wedding invitation. But none of them addressed the core issue. None of them acknowledged that their decision had been hurtful, or that treating me like a financial resource while excluding me from family milestones was fundamentally wrong. They wanted the money to resume flowing without any recognition of why it had stopped. I kept working, kept saving, kept building the life I should have been building all along instead of propping up theirs. The extra $18,000 a year was making a significant difference in my financial trajectory. I was on track to pay off my truck early, my retirement contributions had doubled, and I'd started seriously considering buying property instead of renting. It was almost exactly 6 months after the wedding when my phone rang at dawn on a Tuesday morning. The caller ID showed my brother's number, but the voice was frantic, almost unrecognizable. He was calling to tell me that Dad had been driving around town all night looking for me, and Mom had been crying in the living room since the previous evening. Apparently, they'd received a foreclosure notice. The mortgage payments they'd been making without my contribution were sustainable for a while, but they'd been using credit to cover the gap, and that approach had finally caught up with them. They were behind on payments, penalties were accumulating, and their lender was beginning the process of taking back the house. My brother's call was a mixture of panic and disbelief. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad so quickly, and he seemed genuinely shocked that I hadn't resumed sending money months ago. He talked about the house like it was a family heirloom rather than a financial commitment my parents had made based on income that wasn't entirely their own. I listened to his frantic explanation with a strange sense of detachment. The crisis he was describing was entirely predictable, the natural consequence of spending money you don't have while depending on money you haven't earned. They'd structured their entire financial life around my contributions without ever acknowledging that those contributions were a choice I made month after month, not an obligation I'd somehow inherited. When my brother finished his explanation, he asked what I was going to do. The question struck me as fundamentally backwards. This wasn't my crisis to solve. It was the natural result of decisions they'd made about both their spending and their family priorities. I told them I wasn't going to do anything. This was their house, their mortgage, their financial planning problem. I'd been quietly subsidizing their lifestyle for over a decade, and they'd made it clear that my role in the family was purely financial. Now that I'd stepped back from that role, they were discovering what their actual financial position looked like without external support. My brother's response was a mixture of anger and desperation. He reminded me that family was supposed to help family, that I was being selfish and cruel. I pointed out that family was also supposed to include family, but that hadn't seemed to apply when they were planning his wedding. The conversation ended with him hanging up in frustration, but the calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, I heard from various relatives who'd apparently been enlisted to convince me to change my mind. Cousins who'd been at the wedding called to tell me I was taking things too personally. Aunts and uncles suggested I was punishing the wrong people for my hurt feelings. Each conversation revealed how little they understood about the situation. They saw it as a simple equation. Family needs money. Family member has money. Therefore, family members should provide money. The fact that the family had explicitly excluded that same member from their celebration was treated as a separate, unrelated issue. But for me, the two things were inseparable. The wedding hadn't just been a party I'd missed. It had been a clear statement about my place in their lives. I was acceptable as a financial contributor, but not as a social presence. Good enough to fund their lifestyle, but not good enough to witness their milestones. The foreclosure process moved forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Legal notices were posted, deadlines were set, and my parents' financial situation became increasingly desperate. Dad made several more calls, each one a little more frantic than the last, but none of them included anything resembling an apology or acknowledgement of why I'd stopped sending money in the first place. Instead, he focused on practical arguments about family loyalty and financial responsibility. He reminded me of everything they'd done for me when I was younger, every sacrifice they'd made, every way they'd supported my childhood and education. But he never mentioned inviting me to family celebrations, or treating me like a son rather than a benefactor, or considering my feelings when they made decisions about who belonged at important events. The irony was that I would have resumed the payments immediately if they'd simply acknowledged what they'd done wrong. A genuine apology, a recognition that excluding me had been hurtful and unfair, an invitation to participate in future family events as something more than just a funding source. Any of these things would have changed my perspective completely. But that acknowledgement never came. Instead, they doubled down on treating the money as an obligation rather than a gift, as something I owed them rather than something I'd chosen to provide. Their entire approach confirmed exactly what I'd suspected after being excluded from the wedding. They saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a family member to be valued. Update 1. 3 weeks after my brother's panic call, I was working on a job site when I noticed a familiar truck parked across the street. Dad was sitting behind the wheel, and from his posture, it looked like he'd been there for a while. When I walked over during my lunch break, I could see he'd been crying. He rolled down the window when he saw me approaching, and the words that came out weren't what I'd expected. No demands, no guilt trips, no attempts to negotiate. Just a broken man admitting that he'd messed up everything and didn't know how to fix it. Dad told me that the foreclosure was proceeding, that they had less than a month before they'd have to leave the house. But more than that, he said he'd been driving around for days thinking about what kind of father excludes one son from another son's wedding because he's embarrassed by his job. The shame in his voice was raw and genuine. He talked about how proud he actually was of my work, of the fact that I'd built a successful career with my hands and supported their family for over a decade without ever asking for anything in return. He said he'd let his own insecurities about money and social status override his love for his son, and he didn't know how to live with that knowledge. I stood there listening to this man who'd raised me, watching him fall apart in real time, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. The wedding exclusion had been wrong, deeply wrong, but it hadn't come from a place of malice. It had come from fear and social anxiety and a misguided attempt to help my brother navigate what Dad saw as a complicated social situation. That didn't make it right, but it made it human. Dad asked if there was any way to fix things between us, any path forward that didn't involve them losing their home. I told him I'd think about it, which was more than I'd been willing to say for months. Update 2. I spent the weekend thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. The hurt from being excluded, the satisfaction of taking back control of my finances, the complicated feelings watching my family fall apart financially. None of it felt as clear-cut as it had 6 months ago. Monday morning, I called Dad and asked him to meet me for coffee. When he arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I told him I wasn't ready to just resume sending money and pretend nothing had happened, but I also wasn't comfortable watching them lose their house over what had ultimately been a stupid, hurtful decision. I laid out my terms. First, a genuine apology from everyone involved. Not just regret about the financial consequences, but acknowledgement that excluding me had been wrong. Second, inclusion in future family events, not as an afterthought, but as a valued family member. Third, transparency about their finances so this kind of dependency situation never developed again. Dad agreed immediately, almost desperately. He called my brother and mom from the coffee shop, putting the phone on speaker so I could hear their responses. The apologies that followed were painful and genuine, full of recognition of how badly they'd handled everything. My brother was especially emotional, admitting that he'd been so focused on impressing his new in-laws that he'd lost sight of what actually mattered. But I also told them the financial arrangement was going to be different going forward. Instead of sending money every month with no questions asked, I wanted to help them restructure their budget so they could actually afford their lifestyle without external support. The goal was independence, not indefinite dependency. I agreed to pay the back mortgage payments to stop the foreclosure, but only as part of a plan that would eventually eliminate their need for my help. We'd work together to either refinance to a payment they could actually afford or sell the house and move somewhere more reasonable for their actual income. Update 3. It's been 4 months since that conversation at the coffee shop, and things have slowly started to improve. The foreclosure was stopped, and we've been working with a financial counselor to restructure their budget. It turns out they'd been overspending in multiple categories, using my monthly payments as a cushion that allowed them to avoid making difficult decisions about their lifestyle. The house is now on the market. It was a hard conversation, but they finally admitted they'd bought more house than they could afford even with my help. They're looking at smaller places that will fit comfortably within Dad's pension and Mom's part-time income. My brother and his wife invited me to dinner last month. A small gesture, but meaningful. His new in-laws were there, and they were perfectly pleasant people who seemed genuinely interested in my work. I suspect the sophistication gap Dad had worried about existed more in his head than in reality. The financial support I'm providing now is temporary and goal-oriented rather than open-ended. Instead of sending the same amount every month indefinitely, I'm helping them transition to a sustainable situation. It feels different knowing there's an end point. Knowing this is about helping them build independence rather than enabling dependence. The relationship with my family isn't completely healed. Trust like that takes time to rebuild. But we're talking regularly, and more importantly, they're talking to me like I'm a family member rather than just a financial resource. I'm included in planning conversations, asked for advice about things beyond money, invited to participate in family decisions. I've also learned something about myself through all of this. For years, I've been sending that money partly out of love, but partly because it made me feel important and needed. Having them depend on me financially gave me a role in the family that felt secure, even if it wasn't entirely healthy. Stepping back from that role was scary, but it forced all of us to figure out what our relationships looked like without money as the primary connection. The wedding exclusion still stings when I think about it, and probably always will. But it also taught me that true family relationships can't be built on financial transactions or social considerations. They have to be built on genuine respect, inclusion, and recognition of each person's value beyond what they can provide materially. I'm still contributing to my retirement account at the higher rate, still enjoying the financial freedom that came from redirecting that monthly payment. But I'm also learning that family relationships, like financial planning, work best when everyone involved understands the terms clearly and agrees that they're fair. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone else's poor decisions, even when that someone is family. Sometimes, especially when it's family,